The town of Oak Ridge was the kind of place that felt like it had been left behind by time. Nestled in a valley where the loudest sounds were usually the wind in the tall pines or the distant whistle of the freight train. It was a town of shared histories and unspoken rules, where everyone knew the name of your dog before they knew your ambitions. For the teenagers who lived their life was a comfortable, predictable rhythm. And at the center of that rhythm was the annual community talent show. An event less about discovering talent and more about reinforcing the town's social structure. It was a night for the popular kids to shine, the athletic ones to perform choreographed dances that were more enthusiasm than skill, and the academic ones to do something charmingly nerdy. It was, in short, a perfectly safe stage for perfectly safe people. And then there was Chloe. Chloe existed on the periphery of Oak Ridge High. Like a planet in a distant orbit. She wasn't an outcast in the dramatic movie of a week sense. No one was actively cruel to her. It was more that she was simply not there. She was a ghost in the hallways, a shadow in the cafeteria. Her days were a carefully constructed routine of invisibility. She would arrive at school precisely as the first bell rang, her head buried in a book, and navigate the crowded corridors with an almost supernatural ability to avoid eye contact. During lunch, she would sit alone at a small table in the far corner of the courtyard, not with a book, but just watching the pigeons, her expression unreadable. She was brilliant, effortlessly acing every test. But she never raised her hand in class, never participated in discussions. She was a repository of knowledge with no desire to share it. This profound quietness made her an object of fascination for a different, it's kind of Oak Ridge resident, the popular kids. And leading their pack was a boy named Leo. Leo was the king of Oak Ridge High, not because he was particularly smart or cruel, but because he possessed an unshakable magnetic confidence. He was the starting quarterback, had a smile that could disarm worried parents, and moved through the school with the easy grace of someone who had never known a moment of self-doubt. To Leo and his friends, life was a game, and the world was their playground. Their main source of entertainment was finding small, harmless ways to poke at the predictable fabric of their town. The idea for the talent show prank didn't come in a single flash of inspiration. It evolved over a series of conversations in Leo's basement, a space that smelled of stale pizza and teenage ambition. They were brainstorming acts, tossing around ideas that were all variations on the same theme, making themselves look good while making someone else look a little silly. "We could do another skit," one of them suggested. A lanky boy named Kevin, who was Leo's self-appointed sidekick. "Nah," Leo said, tossing a foam football into the air. "We did that last year. It's tired. We need something with impact. Something people will talk about." They fell silent for a moment, the only sound the hum of the old refrigerator. It was then that another friend, a girl named Brianna, who was more observant than the rest, spoke up. "What about Chloe?" The name hung in the air. Chloe, the girl who was a mystery. The girl who was a blank canvas? What about her? Leo asked, intrigued. "She's just so serious all the time," Brianna continued, "and quiet. I don't think I've ever heard her say more than 3 words at once. What if we got her to do something totally out of character? Something funny?" A slow grin spread across Leo's face. He could see it already. The shy, awkward girl forced into the spotlight. The potential for comedy was gold. "Okay, I'm listening. What's the bit?" "We need a prop," Kevin chimed in, catching on. Something she'd have no idea how to use. They brainstormed a few ideas. A unicycle, juggling pins, a magic kit. But then Leo remembered something. The music room. Behind the stage, there's that old storage closet. Mr. Henderson showed it to me once. It's full of junk from like the 70s. There's this beat-up violin in a case that looks like it's been through a war. A violin. It was perfect. It was elegant. It required skill, grace, and years of practice. It was the absolute last thing in the world someone like Chloe would be associated with. The image of her, stiff and uncomfortable on stage, trying to coax a sound out of that dusty instrument, was exactly the kind of hilarious, harmless chaos they craved. "It's perfect," Leo declared, his eyes gleaming. We'll sign her up. We'll tell her it's for a good cause. Some kind of community spirit thing. We'll make it sound like an honor. The plan began to take shape. They wouldn't be mean about it. That wasn't their style. They would be charming, persuasive. They would frame it as an opportunity for her to come out of her shell. It was a prank, yes, but in their minds, it was a public service. They were helping her in their own misguided way. The next day, they put their plan into action. Leo, with his easy charm, and Brianna, with her disarming friendliness, approached Chloe after school by her locker. She was putting away a heavy chemistry textbook, her movements economical and precise. "Hey, Chloe," Leo said. Leaning against the lockers with a casual air, Chloe flinched, almost imperceptibly, and turned her head slightly. Her eyes were wide and guarded, like a wild animal that had just heard a twig snap. "Hi," she whispered. "So, the talent show is coming up?" Brianna started, her voice warm and friendly. "And the student council is trying to get more people involved, people who don't usually sign up, to show that everyone in Oak Ridge has a talent." Leo picked up the thread seamlessly. "Yeah, and we were all talking, and we just thought, you'd be perfect to represent the quiet, artistic side of our school." Chloe stared at them, her expression a mixture of confusion and suspicion. She said nothing. "We found this really cool old violin," Brianna said quickly, before Chloe could retreat. "It's got so much character." And we thought, what a story, right? The mysterious girl with the beautiful vintage instrument. It doesn't even have to be a long song. Just go up there, hold it, maybe try to play a couple of notes. It would be so symbolic. Leo flashed his most winning smile. "Come on, Chloe, it's for the community. It'll be fun." Chloe looked from Leo's smiling face to Brianna's encouraging one. She felt trapped, pinned by their attention. She knew it was a setup. She wasn't naive. She could feel the joke hovering just beneath the surface of their words, but saying no felt impossible. It would require a confrontation, a defense, a whole set of social skills she had spent years perfecting the art of avoiding. To them, it was a fun prank. To her, it was a nightmare. But the path of least resistance, the one that led to this being over the fastest, was to just agree. "Okay," she said. The word barely audible. Leo and Brianna exchanged a triumphant look, hidden from Chloe. "Awesome," Leo said. "We'll take care of everything. Just show up on the night." "We've got the violin." They walked away, laughing quietly to themselves, already imagining the scene. Chloe stood by her locker for a long time after they left, her hand resting on the cold metal door. She felt a familiar, hollow ache in her chest. It was the feeling of being an object, a puzzle for other people to solve, a prop in their story. She went home that day not to her quiet room, but to the small, dusty attic above her garage. It was her sanctuary, the one place no one from Oak Ridge ever thought to look. Inside, on a simple wooden stand, was not one, but two violins. One was a cheap student model she used for practice. The other, a stunning, deep-bodied instrument with a warm, reddish-brown varnish, was her grandfather's. She picked up the bow, her fingers finding their familiar home on the frog. She didn't play a tune. She just stood there, holding the tools of her secret world, the one part of her that was entirely her own. They thought they were forcing her onto a stage with a prop. They had no idea they were just handing her a key. Asterisk. The week leading up to the talent show felt different to Chloe, as if she were walking through her own life while watching it happen to someone else. The hallways of Oak Ridge High seemed the same low murmur of chatter, the same squeak of sneakers on the polished linoleum floors. But for her, a layer of unreality had settled over everything. She would catch snippets of conversation as she passed clusters of students, and the words talent show and violin would prickle at the edges of her awareness. Sometimes she would feel eyes on her, a quick glance followed by a hushed whisper and a stifled giggle. She knew she was the secret they were all sharing. She had become the town's inside joke, and she was the only one who hadn't been told the punchline. Leo and his friends were careful to maintain their friendly facade. They would give her a little wave or a thumbs up in the hallway, a gesture that said, "We're in this together." But Chloe saw the flicker of amusement in their eyes, the barely concealed smirk that played on their lips. It was a performance, and she was their unwilling co-star. She played her part by offering a small, tight smile in return before quickly looking away, retreating back into the safety of her invisibility. Each interaction was a small stone in her pocket, weighing her down. A reminder of the coming Friday night. At home, the attic became her fortress. While her parents watched television in the living room, completely unaware of the storm gathering around their quiet daughter, Chloe would slip up the pool downstairs and close the hatch behind her. In the dusty, dimly lit space, surrounded by forgotten boxes and old holiday decorations, she would open the worn case of her grandfather's violin. The smell of old wood and rosin was her comfort, her truth. Here she was not the weird, quiet girl from school. Here she was a musician. Her fingers, which seemed so clumsy and awkward when it came to social gestures, would dance across the strings with a confidence and grace that she could never find in her own voice. She would play for hours, not the simple scales she had learned as a child, but complex, soaring pieces that told stories of joy and heartbreak, of struggle and victory. The music was her language, the only one in which she felt truly fluent. It was a secret conversation between her and the ghost of her grandfather, a man who had understood the power of being quiet. On the night of the show, the energy in Oak Ridge was electric. The high school auditorium, a large, stuffy room that usually smelled of floor wax and teenage apathy, was filled with a palpable buzz of excitement. Parents fanned themselves with programs. Teachers patrolled the aisles with stern but proud looks, and the students were a sea of whispering, giggling energy. The stage was bathed in a warm golden light from the massive overhead spotlights, and the heavy red velvet curtains waited to be drawn. It was the biggest night of the year for the town's social calendar, and almost everyone was there. Backstage, it was a controlled chaos of nerves and anticipation. Kids in glittery costumes practiced their dance moves, a boy with a guitar nervously tuned his instrument, and a group of girls sang harmonies in a tight circle. And in the middle of it all was Chloe. Leo had found her just before she was supposed to go on and handed her the prop. "Here she is," he had said with a big, theatrical grin, holding out the old, battered violin case. "Our star." Chloe took it, the worn plastic handle cold in her hand. The case felt light, hollow. She could tell without even opening it that it was a cheap, useless instrument, the kind of thing a beginner would be given. It's an instrument designed to produce frustration, not beauty. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and found a small, quiet corner behind a large painted backdrop of a forest scene. She sat on a wooden crate, the case resting on her lap, just watched. She could hear the show progressing on the other side of the curtain. A burst of applause for a group of cheerleaders. A polite smattering of claps for a boy who sang a slightly off-key pop song. Each sound from the audience was a step closer to her own turn, a tick of the clock counting down to her humiliation. She saw Leo and his friends huddled together a few feet away, their phones out, their bodies shaking with silent laughter. They were so sure of themselves, so confident in their cleverness. They saw her as a prop, a non-person, a means to their own entertainment. They didn't see the girl whose heart was pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. They didn't see the girl who was running through the fingerings of a Paganini caprice in her head, a piece so difficult it was considered a benchmark for a virtuoso. They saw a joke. She saw an opportunity. Then she heard the announcer's voice booming through the speakers. "And now, folks, for something a little different. We have a very special surprise performance by a student who prefers to let her music speak for her. Please give a warm Oak Ridge welcome to Chloe." There was a moment of confused silence from the audience. Chloe? Who was Chloe? Then a light, indifferent smattering of applause started, mostly out of politeness. Leo gave her a final, exaggerated thumbs up and a wink. "Knock 'em dead," he whispered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Chloe stood up. She felt 100 pairs of eyes on her as she walked towards the stage entrance. The backstage noise seemed to fade into a dull roar. Her hand felt sweaty on the handle of the violin case. She took one last look at Leo and his friends, their faces alight with cruel anticipation. She saw not malice, but a profound, unthinking ignorance. They had no idea who she was. and in that moment, something inside her shifted. The fear didn't go away, but it was joined by something else. A cold, clear resolve. She had been handed a stage, a spotlight, and an audience. They thought it was a cage. She was starting to see it as a platform. She walked out from behind the heavy red curtain and into the blinding light. The auditorium was a vast, dark sea of faces, all turned towards her. She could feel the collective curiosity, the expectation of failure. She could feel the weight of the prank, the pressure of all those knowing smiles. She walked to the center of the stage, the cheap violin case still in her hand, and stood there for a long moment, a small, solitary figure under the glare of the spotlight. The audience saw a nervous, awkward girl, a deer in the headlights. They saw the setup just as the pranksters had intended. They were waiting for the punchline. Chloe took a deep breath, the air thick with the scent of dust and hot lights. It was time to begin. Asterisk for a long moment, Chloe just stood there, a statue in the center of the stage. The heavy silence in the auditorium was starting to curdle, becoming thick with impatience. A few more titters of laughter rippled through the crowd, like tiny waves on a stagnant pond. People began to shift in their seats, the sound of rustling programs and creaking chairs suddenly loud in the quiet. They had expected an immediate fumble, a quick, pathetic attempt to play that would confirm their suspicions and give them their laugh. But her stillness was unnerving. It wasn't the stillness of fear. It was the stillness of concentration. Backstage, Leo's grin was starting to feel a little tight. This wasn't part of the plan. The plan was for her to be a mess from the second she stepped into the light. This prolonged silence was weird. It was robbing the moment of its easy, punchy comedy. He glanced at Kevin, who just shrugged, his own smile looking a bit uncertain. The joke was still there, but its rhythm was off. Finally, Chloe moved. She bent down and carefully placed the cheap plastic violin case on the floor. She opened the two worn latches with a deliberate, almost reverent slowness. The hinges groaned softly as she lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded blue velvet, was the instrument they had found for her. It was exactly as pathetic as they remembered. The wood was a dull, lifeless brown, scuffed and scratched in a dozen places. One of the tuning pegs was a slightly different color, a cheap replacement. The strings were a gray tired color, coated in a thin film of dust. It looked less like a musical instrument and more like a child's toy that had been left out in the rain. She lifted the violin from its case. The way she held it was the first thing that seemed slightly off to anyone who was paying close attention. There was no clumsiness in her grip. Her fingers didn't fumble or slip. She held the neck with a firm, familiar ease, her thumb finding its place on the curve of the wood as if it had been born there. She tucked the instrument under her chin, the rough chin rest settling against her skin. Her posture, which had been slightly hunched and defensive, straightened. Her shoulders, once pulled inward, now relaxed and squared. She was no longer a girl cowering on a stage. She was a musician with her instrument. A new kind of quiet fell over the room. The giggling stopped completely. It was replaced by a low, collective hum of confusion. This wasn't what they had been waiting for. This wasn't funny. This was just strange. Chloe reached into the case and took out the bow. The horsehair was grimy and loose, and a few strands were broken. She didn't seem to notice or care. She took a small white cake of rosin from the case's compartment, and with a few quick, practiced strokes, rubbed it along the bow's hair. The motion was so fluid, so automatic, that it was clear she had done it thousands of times before. It was a ritual. Then she did something that truly broke the spell of the prank. She closed her eyes. It was a simple gesture, but it changed everything. By closing her eyes, she shut out the hundreds of staring faces, the judgmental whispers, the entire world of Oak Ridge High. She created a bubble around herself, a private space on that very public stage. She was no longer performing for them. She was preparing to perform for herself. She raised the bow, her arm moving with a slow, controlled grace. She positioned it above the strings, her wrist bent at a perfect, elegant angle. The entire auditorium seemed to be holding its breath, Leo was leaning forward, his brow furrowed, the smirk completely gone from his face. Brianna was watching, her head tilted, a look of genuine curiosity on her face. The joke had evaporated, and in its place was a profound, unsettling mystery. And then she drew the bow across the strings. The sound that came out was not a screech. It was not a squeak. It was not a clumsy, hesitant note. It was a single, clear, resonant G. The note was so pure, so full and rich, that it seemed to defy the pathetic instrument in her hands. It was a sound that didn't belong in a dusty high school auditorium. It was a sound that belonged in a grand concert hall. It hung in the air, shimmering and perfect, a sphere of pure sound that pushed against the walls of the room. It was a note of such professional quality, such undeniable beauty, that it instantly silenced every thought, every whisper, every rustle of clothing. The confused silence of the past few moments was replaced by a stunned, awestruck silence. It was the sound of an entire audience realizing, all at once, that they had made a terrible mistake. Leo felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He looked at the girl on the stage, the quiet girl he had so casually written off as a prop for his amusement. And he didn't recognize her at all. The person standing there, bathed in the spotlight, holding that note with unwavering control, was a complete stranger. This wasn't just a girl who knew how to play the violin. This was an artist, and he had just put her on a stage to be ridiculed. The single G note faded, but the silence it left behind was even heavier. Chloe's eyes were still closed. She stood for another heartbeat, letting the echo of the note die away completely. Then, without a moment's hesitation, her fingers began to move. They flew across the fretboard, a blur of motion that was almost too fast to follow. They danced and leaped, pressing down on the strings with a precision that was almost inhuman. And the music that erupted from the violin was nothing short of explosive. It was a fiery, passionate gypsy melody, a whirlwind of sound that was both technically dazzling and emotionally devastating. The music was a story. It was a story of deep, aching sorrow, of defiant anger, of a desperate longing for freedom. It was the sound of a soul that had been caged for too long, finally bursting its bonds and screaming its truth to the world. The old neglected violin seemed to come alive under her hands. It was no longer a prop, it was a vessel, and Chloe was pouring every ounce of her being into it. The cheap wood, the dusty strings, the loose bound-in of it mattered. Her skill was so immense, her force of will so powerful, that she was transcending the limitations of the instrument itself. She was making magic out of junk. In the audience, people were leaning forward in their seats, their mouths slightly agape. The teachers, who had seen hundreds of student performances, looked at each other with expressions of disbelief. The parents, who had come expecting a night of cute, amateurish fun, were now witnessing something raw and real and utterly captivating. And in the back, Leo and his friends were frozen. Their phones, which had been poised to record a humiliating video, were now forgotten in their laps. The prank had not just backfired. It had been obliterated, incinerated by a fire of pure, unadulterated talent. They had thought they were exposing a girl who couldn't play. Instead, they had inadvertently provided the stage for a genius to reveal herself. The laughter they had anticipated was replaced by a profound, soul-shaking music that was holding a mirror up to their own small, cruel game, and the reflection was ugly. The joke was on them, and it wasn't funny at all. It was terrifying. The music that poured from the old violin was a living thing. It wasn't just a sequence of notes. It was a torrent of emotion, a story told in a language older and more honest than words. The fiery gypsy melody that had erupted from the strings was a declaration of war, rebellion against the quiet, invisible life Chloe had been forced to live. Each note was a spark, each phrase a flame. And together, they were building an inferno on the stage of the Oak Ridge High Auditorium. Her left hand was a blur of motion, a spider dancing across the fretboard with impossible speed and precision. Her fingers, which seemed so awkward when fumbling with a locker combination, now moved with a muscle memory that was deeply ingrained, a part of her very soul. They flew through complex runs and trills, landing on each note with an unerring accuracy that was breathtaking to witness. Her right hand, holding the bow, was the engine of the storm. She drove the bow across the strings with a ferocity that seemed to threaten to snap the cheap wood in half, yet she never lost control. The sound was full and powerful, a roar of defiance that filled every corner of the room, pushing against the walls and the ceiling, demanding to be felt. Not just heard. The melody twisted and turned, shifting from a frantic, desperate pace to a slower, more mournful passage. In these quieter moments, the music became achingly beautiful. It was the sound of loneliness, of long nights spent in a dusty attic, of conversations held in the silence of one's own mind. It was the sound of watching the world from a distance, of never quite fitting in, of a heart that held a depth of feeling no one had ever bothered to look for. The audience, which had been stunned into silence by the initial explosion of sound, now found itself leaning in even closer, drawn into the intimate, heartbreaking world she was creating. People in the front rows could see a single tear trace a path down Chloe's cheek, but she didn't wipe it away. Her eyes were still closed, her entire being focused on the music, on the story she was telling. The tear wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a testament to the truth of her performance. She wasn't just playing the notes, she was living them. In the back row, Leo felt as if he were shrinking in his seat. The air had been sucked out of his lungs, replaced by a cold, heavy dread. The girl on the stage was not the Chloe he thought he knew. This Chloe was a force of nature. The music she was making was so powerful, so full of a life and a passion that he couldn't even comprehend, that it made his own world feel small, cheap, and pathetic. The prank, which had seemed so clever and harmless just an hour ago, now felt like a cruel, stupid act of vandalism. He had tried to paint a masterpiece with mud, and in doing so, he had only succeeded in getting himself dirty. He looked at his friends. Kevin was staring at the stage, his mouth hanging open, his face pale. Brianna had her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and, Leo thought, a dawning sense of shame. They had all been part of this. They had all thought it was funny. And now, they were all being forced to confront the ugly reality of their own cruelty. Amplified by a soundtrack of stunning, heartbreaking beauty, the music began to build again, rising from the depths of sorrow back to a place of defiance. But this time, it was different. The anger was still there, but it was tempered with something else. It was a sense of hope, of resilience. The melody soared, climbing higher and higher, a phoenix rising from the ashes of its own despair. It was the sound of finding your voice after years of being silent, of realizing your own strength after years of being told you were weak. It was a victory cry. And then, as the music reached its absolute peak, Chloe did something that defied all logic. She played a final, electrifying series of notes. A cascade of sound that was so fast and so complex that it seemed impossible for human fingers to create. It was a musical mic drop, a final, triumphant statement that left no room for argument. And as the last, shimmering note hung in the air, she brought the bow down with a sharp, decisive flick of her wrist. And then, there was silence. It was a silence unlike any the auditorium had ever known. It wasn't the quiet that comes from a lack of sound. It was a heavy, profound, reverent silence. It was the sound of 1,000 people holding their breath, afraid to break the spell. The echo of the final note seemed to linger in the air, a ghost of the beauty that had just filled the room. No one moved. No one spoke. They just sat there, stunned, lost in the aftermath of the storm. For a full 10 seconds, the world seemed to stop. Chloe stood on the stage, her chest rising and falling with each deep breath. She slowly lowered the violin from her shoulder, her movements now seeming tired, drained. The energy that had fueled her performance had left her, and in its place was a quiet exhaustion. She opened her eyes. For the first time since she had walked onto the stage, she looked out at the audience. Her gaze swept across the sea of faces, but it wasn't the guarded, fearful look of the girl who had walked into the spotlight. It was a calm, steady look. She was no longer the ghost in the hallways. She was the musician who had just held an entire town captive with her art. She had shown them a piece of her soul, and in doing so, she had claimed her own space in the world. The silence was finally broken by a single sound. It came from the back of the auditorium, from an elderly man who had been a music teacher in the town for 40 years before he retired. He slowly rose to his feet, his old joints creaking, and began to clap. It wasn't a polite, perfunctory clap. It was a slow, deliberate, heartfelt clap, a clap of profound respect. His action was a catalyst. Like a single match dropped in a dry forest, it started a blaze. Another person stood up and joined in, then another and another. A wave of movement began to spread through the auditorium, a ripple of people rising from their seats. The clapping grew louder, faster, more enthusiastic. Within seconds, the entire audience was on its feet. The sound was no longer a simple applause. It was a roar. It was a thunderous, overwhelming ovation that shook the very foundations of the building. It was a release of all the emotion that Chloe's music had stirred up. A tidal wave of awe, admiration, and, for many, a deep, aching regret. Chloe stood on the stage, bathed in the light. As the sound of 1,000 people cheering washed over her, a small, genuine smile touched her lips. It was a smile of relief, of vindication, of a long-held burden finally being lifted. She gave a small, shy bow, not like a performer taking a bow, but like a person saying, "Thank you." Then she turned and walked off the stage, disappearing behind the heavy red curtain. Backstage, the scene was one of chaos. The other performers, who had been waiting in the wings, were staring at the spot where Chloe had disappeared with expressions of utter disbelief. The atmosphere was electric, charged with the energy of the performance they had just witnessed. As Chloe emerged from the stage entrance, a hush fell over the group. They parted for her as if she were royalty, their faces a mixture of awe and intimidation. And then she saw them. Leo and his friends were standing by the wall, looking like they had seen a ghost. They were no longer smirking. They were no longer the cool, confident kings of the school. They were just a group of kids who had been completely and utterly outmatched. Chloe walked towards them, her steps slow and deliberate. She didn't look angry. She didn't look vengeful. She just looked calm. She held the old, beat-up violin in her hand, not like a prop, but like a tool that had served its purpose. She stopped in front of Leo. He opened his mouth to say something, to offer an apology, to make an excuse, but no words came out. His throat was dry, his mind a complete blank. What could he possibly say? "Sorry I tried to humiliate you in front of the entire town because I thought it would be funny." The words were pathetic, meaningless in the face of what had just happened on that stage. Chloe didn't wait for him to speak. She simply held out the violin, offering it back to him. "I believe this is yours," she said, her voice quiet but clear. It was the first time most of them had ever heard her speak more than a single word. Leo stared at the violin, then back at her face. He saw no anger in her eyes, no triumph. He just saw a quiet, unshakable dignity. He slowly reached out and took the instrument, his hand trembling slightly. We, he stammered, his voice cracking. Chloe just shook her head, a small, almost imperceptible gesture. "It doesn't matter," she said softly. And with that, she turned and walked away, leaving them standing there in the deafening roar of the crowd that was still going strong on the other side of the curtain. She didn't need their apology. She didn't need their validation. She had found her own. The music had said everything that needed to be said. The roar of the crowd followed Chloe as she walked away from Leo and his friends. A physical force that seemed to push her forward. Backstage was a different world now, a place of wide eyes and hushed reverence. The other performers, who had been chatting and laughing just minutes before, now stood in silent clusters, their faces turned towards her as she passed. They moved aside, creating a path for her as if she were a queen. No one spoke to her, but their silence was not the cold silence of exclusion. It was the warm silence of awe. She was no longer a ghost. She was the heart of the mystery, the source of the magic that had just transformed their ordinary school talent, show into something they would never forget. She didn't go back to the dressing room. She didn't wait for the show to end. She just kept walking past the confused stagehands, past the painted backdrops, until she found a side door that led to the cool night air. She pushed it open and stepped outside, the heavy door swinging shut behind her, muffling the sound of the still raging ovation. The sudden quiet was a shock. She leaned against the cool brick of the building, the rough texture a solid, real thing against her back. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the crisp night air. It was over. Inside the auditorium, the applause was finally beginning to die down. The announcer, a portly man with a perpetually surprised expression, walked back onto the stage, looking a little dazed. "Well," he said into the microphone, his voice trembling slightly, I don't think any of us were expecting that. Let's have another huge hand for Chloe." The applause started up again, a little weaker this time, but still enthusiastic. But Chloe was gone. The announcer looked around, shrugged, and moved on to the next act, a group of Cub Scouts doing a skit about knot tying. But the energy in the room had changed. The light-hearted, casual atmosphere was gone, replaced by a lingering sense of wonder. The Cub Scouts with their earnest little skit seemed quaint and out of place. It was like trying to put out a forest fire with a garden hose. The next day at Oak Ridge High, the world had tilted on its axis. The story of Chloe's performance had spread through the town like wildfire. By the time the first bell rang, it was the only thing anyone was talking about. The version of the story that was being told in the hallways, however, was a carefully curated one. Leo and his friends, in a desperate attempt to save face, had already begun to spin the narrative. They were no longer the perpetrators of a cruel prank. They were the visionary talent scouts who had discovered a hidden genius. "Yeah, we always knew she had it in her," Leo was saying to a rapt audience by his locker, his voice loud and confident. He had reconstructed his persona overnight, wrapping himself in a cloak of false humility. "We saw her sitting alone and we just thought, a girl that quiet, there's gotta be a fire inside, you know? We just wanted to give her a chance to let it out." His friends nodded in agreement, their faces solemn and serious. They had rewritten history, casting themselves as the benevolent heroes of Chloe's story. And to many people, it was a believable story. It was easier to believe than the truth. But not everyone was buying it. There was a new current running through the school's social fabric, a current of respect for Chloe that was independent of Leo's version of events. Students who had never even noticed her before now looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and admiration. As she walked down the hallway, the whispers that followed her were different now. They weren't mocking giggles. They were hushed, excited conversations. "That's her. I can't believe it was the same girl. My dad said she's a prodigy." Chloe felt the change in the air around her, but she didn't let it touch her. She still walked with her head down, her books clutched to her chest, her pace quick and steady. She was still Chloe, but the world around her had shifted. During lunch, she didn't go to her usual corner in the courtyard. Instead, she went to the library. She found a secluded table in the back, surrounded by tall shelves of dusty books, and sat down. She was just pulling out her textbook when a shadow fell over her table. She looked up to see a girl from her history class, a girl with bright pink hair and a nose ring, who she knew only as Anya. Anya was one of the art kids, a group that existed on the fringes of the school's social hierarchy. Much like Chloe herself. "Hey," Anya said, her voice soft and a little hesitant. "I was at the show last night." Chloe just nodded, not sure what to say. "That was incredible," Anya continued, her eyes wide with sincerity. "Really, I play a little guitar, and I know how hard that is." "What you did? It was like you were speaking a different language. A beautiful one." For the first time, Chloe felt a genuine warmth spread through her chest. This wasn't Leo's self-serving praise. This was a connection, a shared understanding from one artist to another. "Thank you," Chloe said, her voice barely a whisper. "My brother, he goes to the conservatory in the city," Anya said, leaning in conspiratorially. "He's a cellist. I told him about you, and he wants to meet you. He said he could probably get you an audition with his professor." Chloe stared at her, her mind racing. An audition? At a real conservatory? It was a dream she had barely allowed herself to have, fantasy that lived in the dusty attic with her grandfather's violin. It was a door to a different world, a world where her music wasn't a secret, but a calling. I don't know, she stammered. Just think about it, Anya said, smiling. She scribbled a number on a slip of paper and slid it across the table. That's my number. Let me know. Seriously, Chloe, you have a gift. Anya walked away, leaving Chloe staring at the slip of paper. It felt like a treasure map, a promise of a future she had never dared to imagine. Meanwhile, Leo was finding his new role as the discoverer of Chloe to be a heavy burden. The initial thrill of rewriting the story had faded, replaced by a nagging, persistent sense of unease. Every time someone congratulated him, every time someone patted him on the back for giving Chloe her chance, he felt a sickening lurch in his stomach. He was living a lie, and the lie was getting bigger and bigger. He saw Chloe in the hallways, and he felt a strange, complicated mix of emotions. There was still a flicker of resentment, a bruised ego that couldn't quite accept being so thoroughly upstaged. But there was also something else, a grudging respect, a dawning understanding of the magnitude of his own cruelty. He had tried to make her a joke, and she had made herself a legend. And in the process, she had made him a footnote in her story. The breaking point came a few days later. He was in the school's small, in-house television studio, helping the media club with the morning announcements. The teacher in charge, Mr. Henderson, was a kind, enthusiastic man who had been at the school for decades. He was rummaging through a cabinet looking for an old cable. "You know, Leo," Mr. Henderson said, his voice muffled by the cabinet, "I have to thank you for what you did for Chloe." Leo froze. "What do you mean?" "That violin you found," Mr. Henderson continued, pulling out a tangled mess of wires. "The one in the storage closet. That was my grandfather's. He gave it to the school years ago, after he passed away. It was a good instrument once, but it was in pretty rough shape. I always felt bad that it was just sitting there, gathering dust. I'm so glad someone finally gave it a voice." Leo felt the blood drain from his face. The violin, the cheap beat-up prop he had found in the closet, it wasn't just a random piece of junk. It had a history. It had a story. It had belonged to someone's grandfather, and he had used it, this cherished memory, as a tool for his own amusement. The lie he had been telling himself and everyone else suddenly felt paper-thin, flimsy, and transparent. He wasn't a visionary talent scout. He was a thief. He had stolen a piece of the school's history and tried to turn it into a punchline. He walked out of the studio without saying a word. He didn't know where he was going. He just knew he had to move. He found himself standing in front of the music room. The door was ajar. He pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was empty, but the air was thick with the ghosts of melodies past. He walked over to the storage closet and opened the door. There, on the floor, was the violin case, the one he had handed to Chloe. He had completely forgotten about it. He picked it up and carried it to the principal's office. He didn't have an appointment, but the principal's secretary saw the look on his face and waved him in. He sat down in the chair in front of the principal's desk, the violin case on his lap. He told the principal everything. The whole story, from the basement brainstorming session to the moment he saw Chloe on the stage. He didn't try to make himself sound good. He didn't try to spin it. He just told the truth. It was the hardest thing he had ever done. The principal listened patiently, his expression unreadable. When Leo was finished, there was a long silence. "Thank you for telling me this, Leo," the principal said, his voice quiet. "It takes a lot of courage to admit when you've made a mistake." That afternoon, a school-wide assembly was called. Everyone thought it was about an upcoming fundraiser. But when the principal walked onto the stage, they knew something was different. He didn't have any notes. He just stood at the podium and looked out at the sea of faces. "I asked you all here today to talk about something that happened at the talent show last week," he began. "Many of you were there, and many of you have heard the story of Chloe's amazing performance. It was a night that showcased the incredible talent we have here at Oak Ridge High, but it's also important to be honest about how that performance came to be." He went on to tell the true story. The story that Leo had just told him. He didn't name names, but everyone knew who he was talking about. He spoke about the prank, about the cruelty of underestimating someone, about the importance of looking beyond the surface. As he spoke, a quiet settled over the auditorium. The kids who had been repeating Leo's false version of the story now looked at each other, their faces flushed with embarrassment. The lie had been exposed, not with anger, but with a quiet, unshakable truth. Chloe's performance was not a joke, the principal concluded, his voice firm and clear. It was a testament to her incredible spirit and her extraordinary talent. And it is a lesson to all of us about the power of music and the power of a single, brave voice. Chloe, if you're here, we would all like to say thank you. He started to clap. Slowly at first, then faster and louder. The entire school rose to their feet, the sound of their applause a wave of genuine, heartfelt appreciation. Chloe, who had been sitting in the back, stood up, her face flushed. She didn't go on the stage. She just stood there, a small smile on her face, and accepted their apology in the only way she knew how. The next day, Chloe called Anya. The week after that, she took the bus to the city for her audition. She didn't get into the conservatory right away, but the professor was so impressed that he agreed to take her on as a private student. To prepare her for the next year's auditions, it was the first step on a new path. Leo's reputation at school was forever changed. He was no longer the king. He was just a boy who had made a big mistake and had been brave enough to own it. He lost his popularity, but in its place, he found something else. A sense of humility, a conscience. He started to spend less time with his old friends and more time by himself, thinking. He even started taking guitar lessons, not to become a star, but just to understand the language that Chloe had spoken so fluently. The old violin from the storage closet was cleaned and repaired. It was put on display in a glass case in the school's main hallway, with a small brass plaque that read, "The Voice of Oak Ridge." It became a symbol. A reminder of the night a quiet girl taught a whole town what it really means to be heard. And Chloe, the girl who had lived in the shadows, had finally stepped into the light, not because someone had put a spotlight on her, but because she had learned to create her own.